standing right now in front of a water gate, which might be surprising because at the present moment we're standing in a sea of green in a park, the Embankment Park. But why it's so interesting is that it marks the northern boundary of where the Thames used to flow before Joseph Bazalgette built the embankments on which we now stand. Bazalgette built the embankment in 1862 and really profoundly reshaped central London. Prior to the 1850s, there had still been, even in London, a working organic economy. There was a system that ensured that some human waste, at least, was reused, recycled as fertilizer. And that system made sense as a system until about 1848, when the market was undercut by the importation of guano. Foreign guano, especially from Peru, made the whole system stop making sense economically. Recycling human waste could no longer pay for itself. The debate over what the best way to deal with human waste was, I would say, one of the most fiercely contested of the mid-19th century. Very, very crudely, this debate pitted people who believed that water disposal was best against those who believed that land disposal was best. And this was called conservancy. Conservancy was actually about conserving rivers and natural watercourses from the effects of pollution. Of course, famously, what happened to break the deadlock was that in 1858, London had record high temperatures. The Thames began to fester because of all of the human waste which had been accumulating in it. The Great Stink, as it was so called, really drove home to Parliament how urgently action was required, and they finally passed various motions that allowed the construction of the drainage system to begin. So it was a much less considered decision than we might think of it today, and it's certainly always presented as an example of Victorian foresight and rationality and so on. But in fact, when you begin to look in the period prior to the decision, you see that all was confusion. There was very little consensus. There was no precedent for this type of project, certainly not on this scale. So they were winging it in a way that I think very rarely comes through in history books today.
When Bazalgette made this decision to have a combined sewer system, which meant that surface water runoff and sewage were going into the same pipe, he then had to deal with the question of what happens in an extreme rainfall event when the sewers fill up. And so you can't have sewage backing up into people's streets and homes. So the response to that was to have overflows, combined sewer overflows, so that in a heavy rainfall event, dilute sewage would actually still flow back into the Thames. So it's basically a release valve kind of idea. And that made sense because he designed it to happen not very often in terms of a relatively infrequent rainfall event, and that would be such an intense rainfall event that the sewage that was discharged into the river was quite dilute, so it wouldn't have had a major environmental impact. What's happened in the intervening 150 years is that London has grown. We've paved over a lot of green and open surfaces. So the intensity of the rainfall event at which there's sufficient runoff to make the sewers fill up and overflow has become much more frequent. So that now happens on average 50 times a year, that there's dilute sewage overflowing into the River Thames. So we've had this problem of combined sewer overflows into the Thames, and they're happening at a greater and greater frequency, largely because of the changed nature of the surface of London, that there's more hard surface, so more runoff into the sewers. But climate change will also likely increase the intensity of particularly summer rainfall events, so this is going to be a growing problem. And so there was a whole study to look at different options for how to address this problem. And the preferred option, which is now on the verge of being implemented, is effectively to build yet another intercepting sewer. So there's the Thames Tideway Tunnel, which will be a big tunnel under the Thames that will effectively collect those combined sewer overflows instead of them flowing into the Thames. So the key alternative that a lot of people argue for is to try and effectively change the surface of London to stop so much runoff getting into the sewers to start with. The idea being that instead of water just rushing off concrete surfaces and hard roofs into a drain and away from our houses and streets as quickly as possible, that we find ways of actually storing water in our urban landscapes in a way that mimics how a natural hydrological system or a natural landscape would work. So this might mean putting green roofs on buildings that actually soak up and store a little bit of the water and then let it drain away slowly rather than quickly rushing off our roofs. It might mean rainwater harvesting, which is collecting some of that water and actually using it for toilet flushing or garden watering or other things. It might mean more ponds and wetlands and ways of infiltrating water or even storing water, again in our parks, on our streets and generally in the urban environment, to make London more like a sponge rather than just a heavy concrete surface that everything all flows off. And so the idea of that would be that it's solving the source of the problem, which is too much water flowing into our sewers, rather than simply building another sewer to cope with the extra water.
The first time I came onto the roof was when I did my green roof training with some of the premier green roofers in the country. This particular one was laid for sustainable urban drainage, because what the green roof does is it attenuates or holds water. But the green roof has other benefits. Obviously, it delivers biodiversity, it delivers amenity. There's a vegetable garden here and flower garden where the staff come and they have their gardening club. I'm looking at green roofs through anthropological research, and anthropology looks at the way that people make meaning out of the world around them. And in particular, I look at material culture, so I look at things, objects. And in this particular case, the plants and the green roof itself and how people make meaning from that, both personally and in the political process, in the policy process, and for people just coming onto the roof and using it in the amenity sense.
Over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen a lot of changes in social values, including the environment, including the need to take into account more diverse people within society. I think those are the things that engineering now needs to take better account of. We need to be able to better account for the environment as something, not just a resource for economic development, but as something that is intrinsically valued by society itself. And we also need to make sure that our developments do address the needs of groups that may have otherwise previously been excluded from public life, including women, people with disabilities, people from different racial and ethnic groups. So I think those present some real challenges for how we do engineering differently. They present some real challenges for the engineering profession itself in terms of who are engineers. And those are the kinds of things that we need to really grapple with in universities to try and push the boundaries of the industry from where it is now.